Hey friends, I hope your week is off to a great start. Today I'm going to be trying out Molly Baz's recipe for pumpkin bread with salted maple butter. With summer coming to an end, we're entering that time of year where we're going to see pumpkin spice everywhere we look for the next 3 months. So before we're all collectively sick of it, I wanted to try this recipe for 2 reasons. So first, I just love quick breads, and you've seen me make them before on the channel. Second, the weather here in New York is actually starting to feel like fall, and so I'm really craving all of those warm spices that are used in this recipe. I do these Bon Appetit recipe tests every single Wednesday. If you like this one, please be sure to give me a big thumbs up and click subscribe. Without any further ado, let's see how this goes. As always, I'll leave a link to the recipe and ingredient quantities in the description box below. So I'm getting started by portioning out the dry ingredients for this recipe. Now, you may have noticed in my videos that I'm always using measuring scoops, but I'm also using a scale, so why am I doing double work here? Well, the reason for that is Bon Appetit provides measurements in US cups only and not grams. However, I know a lot of you prefer to bake in grams, which I do as well. The issue is that if you use an online calculator to convert US cups into grams, it will almost always be off. So by measuring out the quantities using US cups and weighing the result, I can give you a more accurate representation of the amount of grams to use in the recipe. So Molly does specify to use freshly grated nutmeg. However, you can swap it with a 1/4 teaspoon of pre-ground nutmeg. If you're going to do a lot of baking this fall, buying whole nutmeg is going to come in really handy because it will be used in almost every single fall recipe. For this recipe, we're using 1 entire can of pumpkin puree, and Bon Appetit specified that they do like Libby's brand the best, so that's what I'm using here. So it's 1 15-ounce can of pumpkin puree, which is 425 grams per the label. However, interestingly, there are 440 grams of pumpkin puree inside the can, and that's because companies have to overfill containers so they don't get sued. So if you want to make your own homemade pumpkin puree, that's totally fine. Just use 440 grams of puree. When you're peeling ginger, you could definitely use a vegetable peeler. The downside there is you'll have a lot of waste because the kind of skin on the ginger is so thin that the peeler is taking away a lot of the flesh as well. So if you use a spoon, you can just scrape it right off, and once all of the kind of papery skin is gone, you can go ahead and just finely grate this using a microplane or a box grater. And I did kind of pack it down into the measuring spoons a little bit because the freshly grated ginger was actually kind of fluffy. And then once you've got all those wet ingredients measured out, you can go ahead and start whisking this together. So once the mixture looks homogeneous, you can start streaming in the extra virgin olive oil. So my bowl was a little bit on the small side, and I was having trouble whisking aggressively enough to incorporate the oil without splattering pumpkin batter everywhere. So tilting the bowl on its side allowed me to get a little bit more speed into my whisking action and get that oil evenly incorporated. Once you've got the oil fully incorporated, you're going to add the dry ingredients in 2 separate additions, just gently folding to incorporate between each addition. And I say this in almost every single baking video, but once you add flour to your wet ingredients, you want to mix as little as possible to avoid developing the really tough gluten. So fold this just to get the dry ingredients combined and then stop. And that's going to ensure that you have a really tender and delicious bread. Now that the batter is looking delicious, we're almost ready to bake it. Scrape all of that batter in, and then you want to level it out using the back of a spoon or an offset spatula just to get a nice, even surface. So the recipe calls for a 1/2 cup of pumpkin seeds, which is probably more than you really need. What you're looking for is an even coating of pumpkin seeds over the entire top of the loaf, and you want to make sure that you can press them down and make sure that every single pumpkin seed is touching the batter. If a seed is not touching the batter, it's just going to fall off during the baking process. So I would say cut this tablespoon down to maybe a 1/2 tablespoon, and you'll have a much nicer looking loaf. I'm then popping this into the oven for 80 to 90 minutes until a toothpick inserted in the middle comes out clean. You do rotate 1 time during the baking process. And you do want to let the bread cool almost completely before slicing it. So while the bread cools, it's a great time to make the salted maple butter. So I just did a 1/2 recipe of this butter because I wasn't sure whether I was gonna like it or not. And it turns out it is probably one of the most delicious buttery spreads I've ever had. So I would say don't half this recipe. The quantity in the description box and on screen is to make the full portion, and I 100% endorse making the full portion of the salted maple butter. It's absolutely delicious. When it comes to maple syrup, either dark or amber is fine. Just make sure it's real 100% maple syrup, none of that corn syrup stuff. And the recipe calls for the Maldon flaky sea salt. However, if you don't want to buy the flaky salt just for this application, you would be fine with a fine-grained sea salt as well. The pumpkin bread is out of the oven. I let it cool on a wire rack for about an hour and a half, so it is close to room temperature, though it's a little bit warm in the center still. So I cut myself a nice big slice here. The maple butter is just starting to melt, so this looks fantastic. There's kind of like a crispy crust on the outside. The sugar didn't melt in all the way and it didn't really crisp up, so that visible presence of granulated sugar is a little bit surprising. It didn't look like that in the BA video, but the smell is fantastic. It smells like fall in my kitchen right now, so I'm really excited to try this bread out. So let's see how it tastes. Very crispy, a little bit sweet, very, very tender bread. Really moist. Oh my gosh. The maple butter is so good. It really complements the pumpkin flavor. This is so good. It tastes exactly like fall. So it's got all of those warm spices I was looking for. The maple butter just takes it to the next level. I think it's definitely worth the time to make the maple butter. The little bit of caramelization on the outside of the bread is really nice. The top of the bread is nice and crispy. The inside is super tender and moist. So this bread has really got it going on. So overall, I am really happy with this pumpkin bread. The flavor and combination of textures is exactly what I was looking for. This is satisfying my need for those warm fall spices. And it's so much better than the pumpkin breads that you buy in the store. So I would definitely recommend that you give this one a try. I really hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you did, please be sure to give me a big thumbs up and click subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.